Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into one of history's most fascinating and strangely underreported pastimes, the medieval obsession with stealing sacred objects. Before we get into it, hit that like button if you're enjoying the channel, subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love seeing that. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's travel back to a time when stealing a dead saint was considered both criminal and deeply holy at the same time. Part 1. Venice and the pork-wrapped saint. In the 9th century, Venice had a problem that no amount of money could easily fix. The city was booming. Ships arrived from every corner of the known world. Merchants were stacking fortunes. The Venetian influence stretched further with each passing decade. But Venice lacked something that every great medieval city needed: a genuinely impressive patron saint. In medieval Europe, saints weren't simply religious figures. They were the ultimate civic asset. If your city held the remains of a famous martyr or apostle, pilgrims would travel enormous distances to visit. Pilgrims brought money. Money funded cathedrals. Cathedrals attracted more pilgrims. It was a beautiful economic loop, and the cities that had unlocked it were thriving because of it. Rome had St. Peter. Santiago de Compostela had St. James. Venice had a lagoon and a very ambitious attitude. So the Venetians did what ambitious people do when they want something badly enough. They went and took it. Their chosen target was St. Mark the Evangelist, one of the 4 gospel writers of the Christian faith. His remains rested in Alexandria, Egypt, where they had been kept for centuries inside a local church. 2 Venetian merchants, Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello, sailed to Alexandria in the year 828 under the cover of ordinary trade business. Their actual mission was considerably less ordinary. With the help of sympathetic local Christians, the merchants located the tomb of St. Mark and quietly removed his remains. Then came the genuinely brilliant part: to get the body past Muslim port inspectors, who considered pork ritually unclean and therefore avoided handling it. They buried the relics beneath layers of pork and cabbage inside large baskets. The inspectors looked, recoiled, and waved the cargo through without a second glance. Inside that basket, wrapped in cured meat, was one of Christianity's most venerated saints. When the ship arrived in Venice, the celebration was extraordinary. St. Mark became the city's official patron saint almost immediately. Construction began on what would eventually become the magnificent Basilica of St. Mark, one of the most recognizable buildings in the entire world. The famous winged lion, the symbol of St. Mark, became the symbol of Venice itself. That means the entire identity of one of history's most iconic cities is built, at least in part, on a 9th century smuggling operation. History tends to call it devotion. If you look at it a different way, it was a near-perfect heist. Part 2. The 10-year monk. If the Venetians proved that saints could be smuggled, the monks of a certain French monastery proved something else entirely. Sometimes patience is the sharpest tool available. Across medieval Europe, monasteries competed fiercely for religious relics. Owning the bones of a famous saint was the medieval equivalent of being home to a world-class museum exhibit. Pilgrims came, donations followed. The monastery flourished. So naturally, certain monasteries would look at a rival institution's collection and think, that would look much better here. The relics of Saint Faith, known in French as Sainte Foi, were kept in the town of Agen in southern France. She was already a well-established martyr figure, drawing pilgrims and generating significant offerings for the local church. Meanwhile, the monastery of Conques sat in a more remote region, struggling with a serious lack of foot traffic. Without a famous relic to draw visitors, donations were thin and influence was limited. The monks of Conques devised a solution that was both remarkably clever and completely absurd. They would steal Saint Faith, but they wouldn't sneak in at night. They had a more subtle approach in mind. They sent one of their own monks to Agen with a very specific mission: join the rival monastery, earn their trust completely, and wait for the right moment. The monk arrived, introduced himself, and blended into the community without raising any suspicion. He prayed with his new brothers. He worked alongside them through the seasons. He became, by all appearances, a dedicated and trustworthy member of the monastery. He kept this up for 10 years. After a full decade of patience, 10 years of prayers, meals, conversations, and quiet observation, the monk finally saw his opportunity. He carefully removed the relics of Saint Faith and slipped away from Agen, returning to Conques with the stolen saint hidden among his belongings. When the relics arrived, Conques erupted in celebration. Word spread quickly that Saint Faith now resided there, and pilgrims began arriving in impressive numbers. The monastery commissioned a breathtaking golden reliquary statue to house her remains, an extraordinary work of medieval craftsmanship covered in gold, ancient gemstones, and countless jewels donated by devoted visitors over the years. It survives to this day as one of the finest examples of Romanesque art in existence. Conques became a major stop on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. The monastery prospered for centuries. The monks explained all of this very simply. Saint Faith, they said, had chosen to leave Agen. She had wanted to come to Conques. The monk had merely fulfilled her wishes. It is a remarkably convenient interpretation for stealing a saint, after spending an entire decade pretending to be someone's friend. Part 3. The Sailors Who Kidnapped Santa Claus. In the 11th century, the relics of Saint Nicholas rested in the city of Myra, located in what is now southern Turkey. Nicholas had been a 4th century bishop, known for extraordinary generosity and miraculous deeds. Over the centuries following his death, his legend grew enormously across the Christian world. He became one of the most beloved saints in all of Europe. And yes, this is the same Saint Nicholas who would eventually evolve, through centuries of tradition and folk storytelling, into the figure we now call Santa Claus, which means what happened next is technically the kidnapping of Santa Claus. By the year 1087, the political situation around Myra had become unstable. Turkish forces controlled much of the surrounding region, and cities across Italy were growing nervous that Christian relics might fall into hands that wouldn't protect them properly. This concern was genuine, though it also happened to provide an extremely convenient excuse. Sailors from the Italian port city of Bari decided that the safest possible location for the relics of St. Nicholas was, naturally, Bari. A group of merchants and sailors crossed the Mediterranean to Myra with clear intentions. When they arrived at the church housing the tomb, they did not behave like respectful pilgrims. They forced their way inside. According to accounts written shortly afterward, the sailors confronted the monks who guarded the relics and simply demanded access to the tomb. The monks protested, which is entirely understandable. When strangers arrive and announce they intend to remove your most sacred object, the sailors were unmoved. They broke open the tomb, gathered the bones of St. Nicholas, and carried them back to their ships. As a gesture of goodwill, they left a small portion of the remains behind. When the relics arrived in Bari, the city celebrated as though it had won a war. Construction began almost immediately on the Basilica of St. Nicholas, a grand structure that still stands today and remains one of the most important pilgrimage churches in southern Italy. Pilgrims poured in from across Europe. Donations flooded the city. Bari's reputation and prosperity expanded dramatically. The sailors insisted they had rescued the saint from possible destruction, and perhaps they had. But the outcome, a dramatically richer city with one of Christianity's most famous saints now living in their basilica, made it a very fortunate rescue indeed. Part 4. The Army That Looted a Civilization. Every heist we've examined so far involved a small number of clever people. A pair of merchants, a single patient monk, a boatload of sailors. But the largest art theft of the entire medieval period was carried out, not by a handful of individuals, but by an entire army. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade set out with a stated goal of reclaiming Jerusalem from Muslim control. Instead, through a complicated chain of debts, political favors, and spectacularly questionable decision-making, the Crusader army ended up attacking Constantinople. At the time, Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire and one of the greatest cities on earth. Its churches overflowed with gold icons, jeweled reliquaries, ancient sculptures, silk tapestries, sacred manuscripts, and priceless relics accumulated over nearly 1,000 years. It was, in every meaningful sense, the most densely packed collection of art and religious treasure in the medieval world. In April of 1204, Crusader forces breached the city walls. What followed was 3 days of systematic looting, on a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend. Golden icons were pulled from altars. Libraries were emptied of their manuscripts. Sacred relics were removed from shrines. Bronze statues were toppled from public monuments. Entire wagon loads of treasure were hauled toward the waiting ships. Churches, palaces, and monasteries throughout the city were stripped down to their foundations. When the dust settled, a staggering amount of Byzantine art and treasure had been redistributed across Western Europe. Cathedrals in France, Italy, and Germany suddenly found themselves in possession of magnificent objects that had been in Constantinople the week before. Some of those objects are still there. One of the most recognizable examples is the set of 4 great bronze horses that once stood atop the Hippodrome of Constantinople, the enormous stadium where chariot races and imperial ceremonies had been held for centuries. Venetian forces, who had played a central role in transporting the crusaders, took a particular interest in the horses. Moving several tons of ancient bronze sculpture across the Mediterranean was no small undertaking, but the Venetians were experienced merchants and shipbuilders. They managed it. The horses were installed above the entrance of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, where they became one of the city's most recognizable landmarks. They remained there for centuries, minus a brief period in the early 19th century when Napoleon removed them to Paris after conquering Venice, proving that even stolen artworks can sometimes be stolen again. They were eventually returned to Venice. Today, replicas stand outside in the open air, while the originals are kept safely indoors. Those horses have now been successfully stolen for over 800 years. Part 5. When saints multiplied. By the later Middle Ages, the relic trade had become so active that a strange problem emerged across Europe. Saints began appearing in multiple places simultaneously. Multiple cathedrals claimed to possess the skull of John the Baptist. A single saint who died with 2 arms mysteriously seemed to have donated 4 or 6 of them to grateful churches across the continent. The theologian John Calvin later observed with considerable dry humor that if every claimed fragment of the true cross were gathered together, you could build a full-size ship from the wood. The explanation for this is partly genuine. Relics were sometimes divided intentionally. A small fragment could be placed inside a reliquary and gifted to another church as a gesture of goodwill or political alliance. Over time, however, the tracking of where those fragments came from became increasingly casual, and that created opportunity. Some churches quietly acquired relics through theft. Others purchased them from traveling merchants, who offered sacred objects of uncertain origin. Others simply announced that they had discovered relics through miraculous visions, a claim that was, conveniently, very difficult to verify. Medieval relic authentication was not a rigorous science. Pilgrims rarely questioned the provenance too carefully. What mattered was faith. And if a particular shrine became known for miracles, visitors would arrive regardless of how skeptical a future historian might feel about the origins of the object on display. The competition between institutions was intense. Cities wanted relics that would pull travelers along major pilgrimage routes. Monasteries wanted famous objects that would anchor their reputation. And so relic collections grew, some genuine, some divided from authentic remains, and some that were, charitably speaking, the medieval equivalent of very creative marketing. The result was a continent full of people making long, expensive journeys to visit objects whose histories ranged from legitimately ancient to entirely invented. And it worked. The pilgrimage economy funded some of the greatest architecture, art, and scholarship of the entire medieval period, which means that even the questionable thefts, the patient monks, the aggressive sailors, and the army that looted an entire civilization, all of it fed into something real. The art that survived, the cathedrals that were built, the manuscripts that were copied and carried across borders. They exist today partly because someone, somewhere, decided a particular object was simply too valuable to leave where it was. And so they took it, and history kept moving. That's it for tonight. If you found this as fascinating as I do, leave a comment. I'd love to know which story hit hardest for you. Was it the 10-year monk, the pork-wrapped saint, or the army that looted an entire empire in 3 days? Like the video, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.